Okay. Chapter 12, Part 2. We left off, if you remember, we left off talking about social science and social scientists. And want to think about some of the philosophical differences between, you can think of them as kind of schools of thought in mass communication, but this is not limited to mass communication. This is in the social sciences and really in the sciences in general, because there are different philosophies that underlie certain approaches to research. Okay, so the first idea that I want to talk about is this notion of post-positivism. Post-positivist theory is a theory that is drawn from positivism. So positivism, I should tell you what that is briefly. Positivism is kind of the idea that we can get at absolute truth through science. Okay, that science is really the best way and maybe the only way to learn about the world, and we can, if we can test it and if we can measure it, then we can be confident. If we can't touch it and if we can't test it and we can't measure it, then we can't really say anything definitive. So positivists are really devoted to science. They're hardcore. They pretty much do exclusively quantitative research. That means they do research that where they're going to measure stuff and count stuff with numbers. They don't do qualitative kind of interpretive research, right? A post-positivist then, so that's a positivist. A post-positivist is similar to a positivist, but you could say not as hardcore. They acknowledge that science is really great, but it's not great for studying all kinds of questions. They say that reality is objective, but we as humans, we can't be 100% objective, right? They'll say that quantitative research is great, it's really good, but qualitative research is also, more interpretive research. That's also acceptable, right? So they're similar to positivists, but not as hardcore. So their ontology, their view of reality, is that reality is objective and can be studied objectively for the most part, right? But they acknowledge that human beings are subjective in nature. So that can sometimes compromise what we do from the scientific standpoint. Their epistemology, their way of knowing, again, as I already mentioned, is mostly quantitative, scientific, but they'll accept qualitative methods. Okay, so some pretty significant differences between a positivist and a post-positivist, but there's also a lot of overlap, a lot of similarities. Now, there's another entirely different philosophy. Actually, let me do this one first. No, actually, sorry. Let me do this one. Hermeneutic theory. Okay. Hermeneutic theory is sort of interpretive theory. These are people who, hermeneutic theorists will tell you that this strict devotion to science and empirical methods and quantitative research is deeply problematic. Okay. They say we cannot reduce life to just a bunch of numbers. We can't measure everything. A lot of these measurements are not accurate. We need to introduce, they would say, interpretation and subjectivity into the research process, because human beings are inherently subjective. And not only that, but they would say that reality is subjective. Take a look at that third bullet point, their ontology. They say there is no reality out there. It's just, they'll say, there isn't a truth out there. There are many truths out there. There are many realities. Reality is very subjective. Okay, so they reject positivism for sure, and they even have serious problems with post-positivists. They don't like quantitative research. They don't like these empirical methods. They're not trying to control and predict or produce natural laws. Their goal is to interpret texts. And society, they treat society as kind of a text. So it's there to be interpreted. Okay. Their epistemology, as I've mentioned, is very much subjective. They acknowledge this. They'll tell you, I've just done a study, it's subjective. They use qualitative, interpretive methods. They do not use quantitative methods, these hermeneutic theorists. And just so you guys have an idea, these are serious philosophical differences. So you'll go into like an academic department, and you'll find some positivists, and you'll find some post-positivists, and you'll find some hermeneutic theorists, and in many cases they do not get along, particularly the hermeneutic theorists, especially with the positivists, but even with the post-positivists. They're like, what are you guys doing? I mean, this is just reducing everything to numbers, and it's a different philosophy. It's a different way of seeing the world. It's a different paradigm. Okay. Critical theorists have more in common with hermeneutic theorists, okay, than anybody else. They also don't want to produce natural laws. They don't want to predict. They don't want to control. They do some interpretation, but they don't just want to interpret texts. They don't just want to interpret human behavior. What they want to do is they want to fix stuff. They want to critique things for the purposes of social change. Okay, they'll say that Karl Marx is kind of the original critical theorist, because he said, I am here to critique the system and to fix it. The system he was talking about was capitalism, right? The capitalist order. So critical theorists are interested in critiquing some system or set of systems, and then trying to initiate some kind of a social change. So a lot of people will tell you critical theorists are they're kind of activists in a way. Much more so than post-positivists, or certainly positivists, right? Critical theorists contend that there is an ongoing dialectic, a struggle or a debate between the elites in society and the disadvantaged in society. This is at the core of critical theory, this struggle between the privileged and the marginalized. Okay? All this runs through all different strands of critical theory. And there are critical theorists in sociology, in political science, in mass communication, in all of these different fields. From an ontological perspective, they would say reality is shaped by whomever can dominate the dialectic between structure and agency. Okay? So whoever is in control will be able to shape reality. Okay? So for them, they're looking at things in terms of who's dominating and who's being dominated. Okay? And their goal, from an epistemological standpoint, is to try to free people from some oppression. So you have really different philosophies, really kind of four, because when I talked about post-positivism, I could have easily had a fourth slide about positivism, but I decided not to. So I'm in case you're wondering, not that you'd care, but I would consider myself more of a post-positivist. But I have a great deal of respect for a lot of the research that I read that is hermeneutic or certainly critical theory as well. I drew from a lot of critical theory during my PhD program, and I still engage with a lot of those theoretical perspectives. So what we've done so far, all we're doing right now is I've kind of laid a little bit of a foundation. I want you to understand that there are different philosophical perspectives, and I wanted you to kind of have an understanding of what science is. It was admittedly very quick and dirty. Okay, ideally we would take that over several lectures, but we're just kind of introducing things, right? Because this is not a scientific research class. It's not. I mean, if you take research methods, which I teach, at UNA, we'll go into a lot more detail on some of these things. So what I want to do now is look at some theories from our field, from the field of mass communication. And we have it's difficult to kind of organize them. There are different ways of organizing the theories that have been produced in our fields. That's why if you pick up, like, you can go to the bookstore and get like 5 or 6 different mass communication theory textbooks, and they're all organized differently. One way to organize them is around this idea of powerful effects and limited effects. Not perfect, but let's go with that. So there are some scholars, historically and even today, that would contend that the media exert very powerful effects on individuals and on society. Okay, and one of the relatively simplistic theories, the powerful effects theories, is this idea of the magic bullet or the hypodermic needle. It's not a theory that was tested scientifically per se. So it's not a theory in the scientific sense necessarily. It's more of a perspective, if you will, on how the media work and how they affect people. And it was held by a lot of people around the time of, the 1920s, the 1930s, when Hollywood movies were just getting started. People were really concerned about media, and they thought people are basically powerless against the media. Media messages come and they affect us all. They kind of infect us all. It's like a needle. We all get shot up with the needle, and we're all affected. And we're all affected in the same way, right? The hypodermic needle or the magic bullet. We're all shot up with this magic bullet, right? Fairly simplistic way of seeing the mass media. But one of the examples, which I've talked about, if you remember, is the War of the Worlds. This is cited as kind of evidence of the magic bullet theory, because what happens is Orson Welles goes on the radio, starts telling people that aliens are invading from Mars, and people are terrified. 1 million people, estimates suggest, became terrified. Many of them got out of Dodge, man. They got on trains and buses, and they tried to go west because they thought aliens were invading the Earth. And that's a link. You can actually listen to some of it if you want, or you can Google or YouTube and listen to all of it if you'd like. The War of the Worlds broadcast. It's from 1938, but the quality, so it's 77 years, and the quality still it's very good, and it's very interesting to listen to. But so that was taken as evidence. There were other studies that were done, not great studies, some flaws with these studies, but there was the pain fund studies, which were done over a period of a few years in the late 20s and early 30s, and they seemed to show support for the powerful effects model and mass society theory, which I didn't talk about. Okay, I guess it's not in here, but just so you know, mass society theory is basically the idea that media are harmful. Okay, they harm the masses. They're no good. They're negative. Okay, and the pain fund studies seemed to show support for mass society theory and for the magic bullet theory and for the hypodermic needle theory. For instance, some of the more prominent pieces of evidence from this set of studies was that kids seemed to learn how to light cigarettes from the media. They didn't learn from their peers. They seemed to learn, the evidence suggested, from the media. They also learned other things that at the time were considered problematic, like how to flirt with the opposite gender and so on and so forth. So, and there were other findings related to violence, right? So this was taken as evidence of the magic bullet theory. I already mentioned the War of the Worlds, Orson Welles. That was taken as evidence. But what happens is, as years go by, people start to re-examine some of the data. They start to examine the pain fund studies very closely. They start to re-examine the War of the Worlds data. They start to do other studies. But just to give you an example here, there was a researcher named Harvey Cantrill of Princeton University. He went back and looked at the War of the Worlds data, and he found that it was true that 1 million people became really scared, but he looked at the total number of listeners, and he found that 6 million people were actually listening. So the number, 1 out of 6, is not that large, right? So the majority of people, did not panic. They didn't get scared. Also, importantly, he found that the people that panicked had similar traits. For instance, they were less educated, they had lower levels of self-confidence, they were more superstitious on average, and importantly, they tuned in late. Because remember, in the War of the Worlds, at the very beginning of the broadcast, Orson Welles says, what you're about to hear is acting. But if you tuned in late, you wouldn't have heard that, right? So what Cantrill says is that people were affected differently based on individual differences. And this is an incredibly important conclusion and finding. That, wait a minute, media they don't just affect us like a magic bullet. We're not all affected the same way. It depends on individual differences. This was a very important finding. Okay, so this kind of ushered in, that Cantrill study kind of ushered in the limited effects era. We go from powerful effects, from where the majority of media scholars would have told you in the 1920s and 1930s and into the 1940s that media are really powerful. They affect people profoundly. Then you move into the limited effects era, where scholars are now saying that effects are moderated by individual differences, that the media have some effect on some people some of the time. Okay? And this represents a paradigm shift. It's a major shift in the way people saw the media, right? People in the academy, but then also to a lesser extent, people in the society, lay people, okay? Let's look at some of the evidence for the limited effects model. One researcher named Paul Lazarsfeld was a really hardcore social scientist, okay? He was probably a positivist, or at least certainly a post-positivist in theoretical or philosophical orientation. And he set out to study mass media effects scientifically. He wanted to observe and measure very carefully. He was very skeptical of this idea of the magic bullet. So he did a study between 1940 and 1943 called the People's Choice Study. And it was basically a study on voting behavior. And he went to this community in Ohio, in Erie County, and he interviewed a bunch of people several times over a 6-month period, right, leading up to the elections. And there were about 600 people that participated in the study. And he wanted to know, how did voters choose a candidate? And specifically, he wanted to know, how much influence did the media have on their choices? Okay. So what does he find? He finds that newspapers were a primary source of news. Interesting. Not radio, right? He finds that most households had more than one subscription. He found that newspapers tended to endorse Wilkie, one of the candidates, over FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He found that magazines were used for political information in addition to newspapers. And he found that radio was most useful for providing insights into a candidate's stances. Radio went more in depth in candidates' stances. But more importantly, he found, based on the data, he found that there were 4 types of decision makers. He found that there were these people that he gave them this name, early deciders. These are people who made up their mind, and they stuck to their decision. They didn't change. 49%, it's almost half of the people, were early deciders. There were people who were called crystallizers. These are people who didn't really have a choice early on, but then they voted. They made up their minds. There were waverers. These are people who chose, then they switched, and then they switched back. And then there were the converts. They started off with one, and they voted for the opponent. And what he finds is that, and this is important, media do not appear to have played, according to Lazarsfeld, a major role. Because he says that, again, most people made their decisions very early on and they just stuck with them. During that time, they were seeing media, they were reading the newspaper, they were listening to the radio, but they didn't switch. So that caused him to draw the conclusion that media did not play a major role. But even more importantly, the people who actually kind of switched, the waverers and the converts, they reported that they were more influenced by people than the media, by people they knew personally. So by their friends and family members, right? These, what we call opinion leaders. And that becomes an important concept, the idea of opinion leaders. So they said media didn't really have that big of an effect on us. So what Lazarsfeld ultimately concludes is that the media were there just to kind of reinforce messages, but they didn't change people's minds. And he said, this is evidence, and people that read this said this is evidence for limited effects, not powerful effects. Okay? What comes out of Lazarsfeld's study is what we call the two-step flow theory. So an actual theory comes out of this study. And the idea of opinion leaders is central to the two-step flow theory. The two-step flow theory is very simple. What it says is that information flows from the media to opinion leaders, right? And then the opinion leaders send information and analysis on to other people, to the majority of people, right? So it's two steps. So the media are important, but they're not critically important in his conception, and in the conception of the two-step flow. It's not media are all powerful, because people play a central role in all of this. Okay, that's no good. The following updates are available. Well, I'm just going to do what I always do. Cancel. And then click the little X's. That's worked for me so far. I apologize. Where was I? Gatekeepers. This is an important concept that you have to understand. Gatekeepers are people who screen media messages and then pass on messages that will help others share their views. So think about a gatekeeper. I mean, that's the metaphor. It's like there's a gate and there's all these messages coming in, and the gatekeeper only lets certain messages through the gate. Okay? So there are gatekeepers at news outlets. Like I worked as a gatekeeper, basically. That's not my name. That wasn't my title, but that's what I was doing when I worked in briefly in TV news. I would get all these press releases and emails and phone calls, and I would have to decide what's news and what isn't. So journalists make those kinds of decisions, but then the opinion leaders also make those kinds of decisions, right? Because they kind of screen. They're the ones who are surveying the scene in the media and then passing information on to the rest of us. Now, we might all be opinion leaders. I have to point this out for something. Like maybe you're an opinion leader on, on sports, or maybe on certain area of politics that you're an expert in. So maybe your friends go to you and say, well, let's find out what so-and-so says about this and what he thinks or what she thinks, because they're our opinion leader on this particular matter. But this is very different from kind of a powerful effects view of the mass media, the two-step flow theory. And again, the two-step flow theory comes out of Lazarsfeld's People's Choice studies. And this is just a little bit more detail on everything that I was just saying. The diffusion of innovations theory which was developed by Everett Rogers in the early 1960s, kind of expands the two-step flow theory to multiple steps. So he was saying it's not just two steps. There are many steps. And Rogers came along and did a bunch of research. He was actually doing research on how farming inventions were diffused through the farming system, right? How farmers adopted certain innovations. So, technological innovations, that is. And specifically, he said there were 5 different adopter categories. He said there are the innovators, the early adopters, the early majority, late majority, and then finally the laggards. So he would say, Everett Rogers, and this theory, the diffusion of innovations theory, would say that it's more complicated than two-step flow. What happens when some idea is introduced, whatever the idea is, some people adopt it. Those are the innovators. Other people will get to it a little bit later, but still pretty early. And then a majority of people will go a little bit later. Those are the early majority. And then another huge chunk of people will adopt it late, whatever the idea is. And then there are a few people who will adopt it really late. So you can think of any new innovation or idea in these terms. So think about Facebook. There were some people that were on Facebook in 2004. And then some others that were in there in 2005 and 2006. Those are probably the early adopters and the early majority. Then by people that got onto Facebook in 2007 and 2008, that was probably the late majority. And then some people are still not on Facebook, and they might not get on Facebook, right? That's not a bad thing, by the way. I'm just, that's just an example. You can look at pretty much any idea and think about it in these terms. That's what Everett Rogers would argue. So that's also a limited effects theory, because again, it assumes that people play in these early adopters and innovators. These people play a very important role in allowing something to diffuse. What are the assumptions of the limited effects theories? Well, one assumption is that empirical social research methods, the kinds that positivists and post-positivists use, can be used to generate theory through an inductive research process. They also assume that the role of mass media in society is relatively limited. It's not all-powerful. It's not an all-powerful role played by mass media. They say that the mass media's role in the lives of individuals is limited, but that it can be dysfunctional for some types of people. Okay? And they also assume that the U.S. political and social system is both stable and equitable. Now, this is still a dominant perspective. There was a paper written in 1960 by a researcher named Joseph Clapper, basically arguing for limited effects. And that paper continues to be really influential. There are a lot of media scholars that have a limited effects perspective. I'm a little bit different because even though I do quantitative empirical research and I would consider myself a post-positivist, I don't think the kind of effects that the media exert are limited, or at least they're not only limited. I think that in many cases the effects of mass media are very powerful, and I think it's difficult to measure in some cases. In fact, difficult to quantify. But many studies have done so, have actually quantified and measured some really profound effects, and that's one of the reasons why I look at that evidence and I say, well, that's not, and that doesn't seem like limited effects to me. But that's my perspective, and obviously people can rightly disagree and debate. The drawbacks of the limited effects approach: surveys and experiments are great, but they do have some methodological limitations, and it's sometimes good to expand beyond those methods. And those are the methods those are pretty much the only methods that these people will use to measure effects. But there are other methods, qualitative methods, that can be used, that can shed a lot of light. The methodological limitations of early empirical research led to findings that systematically underestimated the influence of mass media. That's what I would argue. Now, again, some scholars would contest that. They would say, no, they didn't underestimate the effects. But I would argue that they did. And I think it's because I think the way they were doing the studies was flawed. They would basically, to oversimplify a little bit, they would sit people down in a room, ask them some questions, show them a movie, and then ask them some more questions and say, okay, well, let's see what happens. And the reality is the effects that we're talking about don't happen in 2 hours. They happen over long periods of time, over prolonged exposure. Okay. A spurious effect is a finding in a research study that exists only in that study. It's a product of that study only. And I think a lot of people would argue that that was happening in a lot of these studies that were being conducted. Early research also, this is an important point, they were focusing on whether or not media had an immediate, powerful, direct effect. But other kinds of influence were ignored. So, for example, they would look for behavioral effects, but they wouldn't study attitudinal effects. But attitude is big. That's important. If your attitude changes, then down the road, your behavior may change, you see. But there are, the limited effects paradigm has to be credited with kind of debunking that overly simplistic mass society theory, hypodermic needle, magic bullet theory. It's certainly not as simple as those ideas led us to believe, or led people to believe in the 1920s and 1930s, and the limited effects scholars have to be given some credit. Also, the paradigm prioritized empirical observation, which is, generally speaking, I would agree that that's a good thing. We need to be able to observe and measure things. What I would argue is that we need to be very careful in how we observe and measure. We need to be comprehensive in our analyses, and we need to know how to look for the right things. And we also need to think about effects more broadly and more generally. We need to expand our conception of effects. That's what I would argue. Moderate effects. Let's stop here and look at moderate effects in part 3. We might end up doing this in 4 or even 5 parts. I don't know. This is a long lesson. So anyways, stay tuned.